November 18, 1956. Moscow, a room filled with Western diplomats. And then Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, said 7 words that would echo through the Cold War. "We will bury you." The threat was clear. The challenge was unmistakable. But what most people don't know is how a young senator named John F. Kennedy interpreted this threat, and how that interpretation would later shape his entire presidency. What they don't know is the deeper meaning Kennedy saw behind those words, and what they definitely don't know is how that understanding would guide him through the most dangerous confrontation in human history. This is that story. The year was 1956, and the world was divided. On one side, the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. 2 superpowers, 2 ideologies, and between them, the very real possibility of nuclear annihilation. Khrushchev had just delivered his infamous speech at the Polish embassy in Moscow. Western ambassadors sat in stunned silence as the Soviet premier pounded his fist and declared that communism would outlast capitalism. "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side," he said. Then came those words, "We will bury you." The statement made headlines across America. Newspapers screamed warnings, politicians demanded action. Fear gripped the nation. Was this a declaration of war? A promise of nuclear attack? Americans went to bed that night wondering if they would wake up to see another morning. But in Washington, a 39-year-old senator from Massachusetts was paying very close attention. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had just won re-election to the Senate. He was young, ambitious, and increasingly concerned about America's position in the world. While others panicked, Kennedy did something different. He studied, he analyzed, he tried to understand not just what Khrushchev said, but why he said it. Kennedy had been following Soviet affairs closely since his days in the House of Representatives. He had read Marx, he had studied Lenin. He understood that communist rhetoric often served multiple purposes, and he suspected that Khrushchev's dramatic statement was more complex than it appeared. In the weeks following Khrushchev's speech, Kennedy began speaking publicly about the Soviet threat. But his approach was different from his colleagues. While others called for immediate military buildup and aggressive confrontation, Kennedy urged understanding, not sympathy. Understanding. There's a difference. In a speech later that year, Kennedy stood before an audience and said something remarkable. He explained that when Khrushchev said, "We will bury you," he wasn't necessarily threatening military conquest. The Russian phrase, Kennedy noted, could also mean, "We will outlast you," or "We will be present at your funeral." It was a prediction about history, not a promise of aggression. But Kennedy didn't stop there. He went further. He said something that shocked many in attendance. He said that Khrushchev might actually believe what he was saying, that the Soviet leader genuinely thought communism would triumph through economic and social competition, not war. And then Kennedy said the part that made headlines. He warned that if communism ever prevailed, it would not be because of Soviet strength, but because of American failure to live up to its own ideals. The room went silent. What was Kennedy suggesting? That America was weak? That communism might actually win? No, Kennedy was saying something far more nuanced. He was arguing that the real battle of the Cold War wouldn't be fought with missiles and tanks. It would be fought with ideas, economic systems, and the ability to inspire people around the world. If America wanted to win, it needed to be better, not just stronger, better. This was 1956. Kennedy was still 4 years away from the presidency, but already he was developing the philosophy that would define his administration. He believed that America's greatest weapon wasn't its nuclear arsenal. It was its values, its promise of freedom and opportunity,
its ability to show the world a better way to live. But believing something and proving it are two different things, and Kennedy would soon get his chance to put his ideas to the test. Fast forward to 1960. Kennedy was now campaigning for president, and Khrushchev was still talking. The Soviet leader had become bolder, more aggressive. In September 1960, Khrushchev came to New York for a session of the United Nations General Assembly, and he put on quite a show. He interrupted speakers, he heckled delegates, and in one infamous moment, he took off his shoe and banged it on his desk to show his displeasure. Kennedy watched all of this carefully. He was locked in a tight race with Richard Nixon, and foreign policy was a central issue. Nixon argued that his experience as vice president made him better prepared to stand up to the Soviets. Kennedy countered that experience without wisdom was meaningless, that understanding your enemy was more important than simply threatening them. On the campaign trail, Kennedy often referenced Khrushchev's "we will bury you" statement, but he used it to make a point about American resolve. In speeches across the country, Kennedy told crowds that Khrushchev was wrong, that America wouldn't be buried, but not because of military might alone. America would prevail because of what it stood for, because of its commitment to human dignity and freedom. The audience applauded, but some wondered, was Kennedy tough enough? Could this young senator really stand up to a man like Khrushchev? Kennedy won the election in November 1960, barely, one of the closest races in American history. And immediately, he began preparing for what he knew would be his greatest challenge, dealing with the Soviet Union, dealing with Khrushchev. The two men finally met face-to-face in June 1961 in Vienna, Austria. The summit was supposed to be a chance for the new president and the Soviet premier to size each other up, to find common ground, to ease tensions. It turned out to be one of the most brutal diplomatic encounters in Cold War history. Khrushchev came ready for a fight. He had heard that Kennedy was young, inexperienced, and potentially weak. The disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion just 2 months earlier seemed to confirm this. Khrushchev decided to test the new president, to push him, to see if he would break. Over 2 days of meetings, Khrushchev battered Kennedy with aggressive rhetoric. He lectured him about history, about ideology, about the inevitable triumph of communism. He brought up the "we will bury you" statement again, not as a threat, but as a statement of historical fact. He told Kennedy that the correlation of forces was shifting toward the Soviet Union, that American capitalism was in its death throes, that the future belonged to communism. Kennedy listened, and then he responded, not with bluster, not with threats, but with a clarity that caught Khrushchev off guard. Kennedy said that both sides had different beliefs about how society should be organized. That was fine, but those differences could not be allowed to lead to nuclear war. The stakes were too high. The consequences were too terrible. Both sides had to find a way to compete without destroying each other. Khrushchev wasn't impressed. He kept pushing. The tension in the room was thick. Kennedy's advisors were worried. They had never seen their president so challenged, so tested. At one point, Khrushchev threatened to cut off Western access to Berlin. Kennedy responded that if Khrushchev wanted war over Berlin, that was his decision to make, but America would not back down. The summit ended with no agreements, no breakthroughs. Kennedy left Vienna shaken. He later told a journalist that it was the worst experience of his life, that Khrushchev had savaged him, that the Soviet leader thought he could bully the United States because its president was young and untested. But something happened after Vienna. Something shifted in Kennedy. The experience didn't break him, it hardened him, it clarified his thinking. He realized that Khrushchev respected strength, but not the kind of strength that comes from threats, the kind that comes from resolve, from the willingness to stand firm when it matters most. Over the next year, Kennedy demonstrated that resolve repeatedly. When Khrushchev built the Berlin Wall in August 1961, Kennedy reinforced the American garrison in West Berlin and made clear that any threat to the city would be met with force. When the Soviets resumed nuclear testing, breaking a voluntary moratorium, Kennedy ordered the United States to do the same. He was learning to speak Khrushchev's language, the language of strength, backed by action. But Kennedy never forgot the deeper message of Khrushchev's "We will bury you" statement. He never forgot that the real competition was about systems, about ideas, about which society could deliver a better life for its people. And so, even as he built up America's military, he also launched ambitious programs at home. The Peace Corps, the space program, efforts to combat poverty and expand civil rights. Kennedy understood that if America wanted to win the Cold War, it had to show the world what freedom could accomplish. And then came October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when Khrushchev's "We will bury you" threat became terrifyingly real. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from American shores, capable of reaching Washington, New York, and dozens of other cities within minutes. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war, closer than it had ever been before or has been since. For 13 days, Kennedy and his advisors debated how to respond. Some urged immediate military action, bomb the missile sites, invade Cuba, show Khrushchev that America wouldn't be pushed around. Others counseled caution, a diplomatic solution, anything to avoid nuclear war. Kennedy had to make the most important decision of his life, perhaps the most important decision any president has ever made. He chose a middle path, a naval blockade of Cuba. He called it a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of the word blockade, which is an act of war. He demanded that Khrushchev remove the missiles, and he made clear that any nuclear attack from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union itself, requiring a full retaliatory response against Soviet territory.
The world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying more missiles steamed toward Cuba. American naval vessels formed a line in the ocean, ready to stop them. At the United Nations, the American ambassador confronted his Soviet counterpart with photographs of the missile sites, demanding an explanation. The Soviet ambassador refused to answer. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters, urgent, sometimes desperate communications seeking a way out of the crisis. Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter offering to remove the missiles if Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. Then he sent another letter, more formal, demanding that America also remove its missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's advisors were divided on how to respond. Time was running out. At any moment, something could go wrong, a miscommunication, an accident, a trigger-happy commander. And then it would be too late. Nuclear war would begin, and tens of millions would die, maybe hundreds of millions. Kennedy made his decision. He would accept Khrushchev's first letter and ignore the second. America would promise not to invade Cuba. And quietly, without public announcement, American missiles in Turkey would be removed several months later. It was a compromise, a face-saving solution for both sides, but it worked. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world stepped back from the abyss. Kennedy and Khrushchev had stared into the nuclear void and chosen peace over pride. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. Kennedy and Khrushchev developed a grudging respect for each other. They had been through the fire together. They had both chosen restraint when they could have chosen war. And they both realized how close they had come to destroying everything.
In June 1963, Kennedy gave one of the most important speeches of his presidency at American University in Washington. He called it a speech about peace. He said that Americans needed to re-examine their attitude toward the Soviet Union, that both sides needed to focus on common interests, not just differences. He acknowledged that the Soviets had suffered terribly in World War II, losing 20 million people. He said that no nation had ever suffered more, and he called for an end to the arms race, for a nuclear test ban treaty, for a new approach to the Cold War.
The speech was broadcast in full on Soviet radio. Khrushchev called it the best speech by an American president since Roosevelt. Within weeks, negotiations began on a treaty to ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. Kennedy and Khrushchev both signed it in August 1963. It was the first arms control agreement of the Cold War, a small step, but a crucial one. Khrushchev never publicly retracted his "we will bury you" statement, but his actions after the Cuban Missile Crisis showed that he had learned the same lesson as Kennedy, that nuclear war was unthinkable, that both sides had to find a way to coexist, that ideology couldn't be allowed to trump survival. Kennedy didn't live to see how the Cold War would end. He was assassinated in November 1963, just 3 months after signing the test ban treaty. But his understanding of Khrushchev's challenge had set a template for how future presidents would handle the Soviet Union. Strength combined with restraint, military readiness combined with diplomatic engagement, competition combined with cooperation where possible. Khrushchev fell from power in 1964, removed by his own colleagues who thought he had become too erratic, too risky. He spent his final years in quiet retirement, dictating his memoirs. In those memoirs, he wrote about Kennedy. He said that despite their differences, he had respected the young president, that Kennedy had been a worthy adversary, that their confrontation during the missile crisis had been a turning point in his own thinking. As for the "we will bury you" statement, Khrushchev later tried to clarify what he meant. He said he was speaking about economic competition, not military conquest, that he believed communism would eventually prove itself superior through peaceful means. Whether that was his original intent or a later rationalization, we'll never know for certain, but Kennedy's interpretation stands as a model of how to deal with provocative rhetoric from an adversary. Don't overreact, don't underreact. Understand what's being said, and respond with strength, clarity, and a commitment to peace when possible. The Cold War lasted another 26 years after Kennedy's death, but it never again came as close to nuclear war as it did in October 1962. Kennedy and Khrushchev's shared experience in that crisis created a framework for managing superpower competition. A hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow so leaders could communicate directly in emergencies. Arms control negotiations became a permanent feature of the relationship, and both sides developed a healthy respect for the danger of miscalculation. In the end, Khrushchev was wrong. The Soviet Union didn't bury America. Communism didn't triumph. The USSR collapsed in 1991, brought down by its own internal contradictions, its inability to provide for its people, its failure to deliver on its promises. The competition that Khrushchev spoke of in 1956 did happen, and the system that Kennedy defended, for all its flaws, proved more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of self-correction. But Kennedy was also wrong about something. He believed that the competition with the Soviet Union would be won through ideas and economic performance. He was right about that. But he also believed it would take generations, that the struggle would define the entire 20th century. He didn't live to see how quickly the Soviet system would crumble once its own people lost faith in it. What Kennedy got right, what he understood better than almost anyone in 1956, was that Khrushchev's threat wasn't really about burial. It was about validation. Khrushchev wanted the world to acknowledge that the Soviet system worked, that communism was the future, that history was moving in his direction. Kennedy's interpretation was perfect. He didn't argue about history. He focused on the present, on making America work better, on showing the world what freedom could accomplish, on winning the competition the only way it could be won, by being better. That's the real story of what Kennedy understood when Khrushchev threatened to bury America. It's not a story of insults traded or threats made. It's a story of how a young leader learned to interpret provocation with wisdom instead of anger, how he turned a challenge into an opportunity, how he chose strength over weakness, but also peace over war, and how, in the end, he helped both sides step back from the brink when it mattered most. Khrushchev's words echoed through the Cold War, but Kennedy's understanding shaped how it ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet collapse of a system that couldn't deliver on its promises. History didn't bury anyone, but it did render its judgment. And Kennedy, standing in 1956 as a young senator trying to understand a Soviet premier's provocative words, saw more clearly than most where that judgment would lead.
The information presented in this video is derived from historical records, presidential archives, published memoirs, and scholarly works cited in the sources. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. Viewers are encouraged to consult the listed sources for deeper research and alternative perspectives. This content is intended for educational purposes.